Hello, and welcome to this Britlit 10 video podcast on Romanticism. Today, Lesson 2, Key Concepts in the Romantic Movement. Before we begin, I ask that you give the material the time and the attention that it deserves. I reserve the right to give you a pop quiz on any homework assignment, including this video podcast. You may also be held responsible for this material on high-value assessments such as projects, essays, and exams. Please resist the temptation to multitask and close all other programs on your computer except those that you might use for note-taking. As you watch and listen, take notes, stopping and replaying the video as necessary. Be prepared to apply what you've learned in this video to your reading of the literature. Let's begin. In Lesson 1, we covered the three core principles of the Romantic movement: imagination, nature, and the individual. Today, in Lesson 2, we will take a look at 5 key concepts by which those principles are pursued: the pastoral, the primitive, the exotic, the sublime, and the Gothic. It is important to understand that these terms are sometimes interrelated and sometimes contradictory. No two Romantic writers approach them in the same way, and it will be your job as a reader to determine how a given concept applies to a given work. So let's take a look at the first key concept, the pastoral. You will recall from Lesson 1 that the Romantic movement questions much of what was valued in the previous few centuries. You will also recall that the Romantic movement coincides with the Age of Revolutions. The Age of Revolutions inspired in the Romantic imagination a sense of idealism about the future. Ironically, in order to imagine a brighter future, Romantic artists often look to an equally imaginary pre-industrial past. The pastoral is a concept that dates back to ancient Greece. It idealizes the rural landscape by imagining it as clean and unspoiled. In a pastoral landscape, animals don't make rude noises or emit unpleasant odors. In a pastoral landscape, the dirt isn't dirty and the insects never bite. In a pastoral landscape, the grass is always green and the sun always shines. Pastoralism also idealizes the people who inhabit that landscape, imagining them as innocent and carefree. Farmers, shepherds, and milkmaids on the pastoral landscape never break a sweat. They love their work, laboring from dawn to dusk without worry or complaint. Of course, real rural landscapes and people aren't like this at all. The rain does fall, crops don't grow, bugs do bite, and the work is dirty, smelly, and backbreaking. But Romanticism, as you will recall, does not reflect the world as it is, but rather the world as it could be. Christianity borrows the pastoral from the ancient Greeks to describe Jesus as a shepherd who tends and leads the Christian flock. Extending this pastoral metaphor, Christianity also depicts Jesus as a sacrificial lamb who dies for the sins of mankind. In the creation of their art, the Romantic writers would draw upon both pagan and Christian pastoral imagery. For them, modern civilization and industrialization were destroying the natural world and man's connection to his environment. Pastoralism gave them a way to imagine both man and nature in an idealized, pre-industrial state. So let's take a look at the next concept, the primitive. A concept related to the pastoral primitivism idealizes individuals and cultures that exist outside of the corrupting influence of the modern, industrialized world. The Romantic artists thought that civilization sapped man's vitality, corrupted his morality, and dulled his senses. In other words, the modern world removed man from the very things that makes him human. The antidote for some romantics was to celebrate and to emulate those people who were untouched by such corruption, rural, agrarian people, and the folk art that they produced. Consequently, Romantic poetry often employs vernacular language, the language of the common people, and it takes as its subject people and places that are thought to be wild or untamed. Of particular interest to the Romantics were children, whose innocence was of value to be celebrated, maintained, and emulated in the face of an unforgiving world. So let's take a look at the next key concept: the exotic. Exoticism idealizes other cultures, particularly those of Asia and the Middle East. These cultures too were imagined to be outside the influence of the industrialized Western world. They were also thought to be mysterious and dangerous, qualities that were central to exoticism's allure. Both primitivism and exoticism were attempts by the artist to live one's life with authenticity, that is, to maintain one's individuality despite the pressure for social and cultural conformity. The paradox, of course, is that in trying to live authentically, they often adopted and distorted the attitudes and practices of other people and other cultures. So let's take a look at the next key concept: the sublime. The sublime is a feeling associated with intellectual, spiritual, physical, or aesthetic magnitude. The sublime is an emotional product of an encounter with something that is beyond human comprehension, explanation, or imitation. The sublime can be aroused in a number of ways. For the Romantic writers, the sublime was an effect of an encounter with nature, usually in solitude. The sublime is a recognition of vast differences in scale. It lays bare man's physical and temporal insignificance in the face of the beauty and vastness of our natural surroundings. The sublime is the synthesis of two contradictory emotional states: pleasure and wonder on the one hand, and terror and awe on the other. Anyone who has ever stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon will know what the sublime feels like. If you've ever stood atop a mountain, or in a desert valley to watch the sun rise, or sailed on a boat in the open sea, you may know the feeling too. Finally, here's the fifth key concept: the Gothic. The term Gothic comes from the Goths, the Germanic tribes that overran the Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries. By virtue of its origins, the Gothic is both primitive and exotic. The term would later come to represent the Christian culture of 12th, 13th, and 14th century medieval Europe. The term Romantic comes from Romans, the French name for the chivalric tales that rose to popularity in the Middle Ages. In that context, the word meant imaginary, fantastic, or heroic. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the word meant the same thing, but it was used pejoratively to identify things that were frivolous and trivial. The term romantic would not come to be associated with love until the early 20th century. Looking back to these Germanic and medieval roots, Romantic writers borrowed those Gothic themes and motifs that they found useful and desirable, including the ritualistic, the irrational, the wild, the fantastic, and the supernatural. A major vehicle for Gothic expression was architecture. Sprawling and ornate, Gothic architecture is recognizable by several structural and decorative features, including the pointed arch, the flying buttress, and the ribbed vault. Gothic architecture builds on a massive scale that intends to instill in the viewer a feeling of pleasure, wonder, awe, and terror, a sense of the sublime, as one stands in the presence of God. Gothic architecture became less popular in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries when the style was considered excessive and ornate. However, the late 18th and early 19th centuries saw a secular revival of the form, and many works of literature used Gothic manor houses, castles, and cathedrals as their setting. Especially interesting to the Romantic writers were the dark, damp, atmospheric places in Gothic structures, their dungeons, their underground passages, their unlit stairwells, all of which emanated a sense of mystery, gloom, and terror. When none of these structures were present, a natural formation such as a cave or a deep chasm in the ground would serve as a suitable substitute. For the Romantics, a building was most appealing when it was in a state of ruin or decay. Such ruined structures were aesthetically pleasing, the Romantics thought, evoking in the viewer a sense of dread, loss, and longing, and serving as a reminder that even man's greatest achievements could not stand up to the test of time. That concludes this Britlit 10 video podcast on the key concepts of Romanticism. In class, we'll begin reading Romantic poetry. See you then.